everybody. It seems like you're also always supposed to start with a joke, but I worked hard on this part. So a Rosh Yeshiva and academic are sitting next to each other on the airplane. And they start to, say they're reading interesting texts. So the Rosh Yeshiva leans over to the professor and says, "What do you do?" He says, "Oh, I teach." He says, "Oh, I teach too." He says, "What age do you teach?" He says, "I teach like 18 to 22, 23. He says, "Oh, I teach that too." He says, "How big are your classes?" "I have classes between 250, 500. Rosh Yeshiva says, "Wow, you must go to a lot of weddings." I thought that was an appropriate way to introduce something about this topic of the academy and the yeshiva, because frankly, as somebody right out of high school, I started at yeshiva in 1980, and it's just hard to imagine that I'm older than Rabbi when I first met him at this point. And one of the experiences of yeshiva is a profound intellectual and religious experience. But the intellectual is something that, especially coming out of day schools in North America, is something really unique. It's all-encompassing. And if you're enjoying it, it's very natural when you then go on to university to pursue that intellectual strain of understanding of our own tradition, where it happens in a very different context. And so the people who put together these panels for the pre-dinner program thought that this question of the relationship of the yeshiva world, particularly of Yeshivat Har Etzion and Oz, to academic studies was worth hearing from august panelists, several of whom have just recently made that transition. And I'll be really just asking a few questions, but to keep in mind that as much as we say traditional yeshiva study, certainly in the world of Brisk, it's a sort of an accepted range of academic approach or intellectual approaches and methodologies. When it comes to academic Jewish studies, we have to acknowledge that there's a tremendous diversity, what we mean, both in terms of period, subject matter, and methodology. So I think we're going to cover quite a few questions this afternoon, and I will really be focusing on the comparison and contrast and whether these two fields and approaches have something to contribute to each other, or their tension is something that can be addressed either fruitfully or in other ways. And I'm sure we'll pepper the entire hour with anecdotes of stories that we know and conversations we've had with the people who mean so much to us. So I'll just start off by, we'll start off with you, Yael. But the question is really, what would you take, in a brief way, what would you take to be the conceptual or intellectual difference between traditional study in a yeshiva and academic Jewish studies? How do we approach Torah? How do we approach halacha in those two worlds? How would you summarize the distinction or difference?
So, thank you. And should I use this? Does this help?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I have one here.
So, first of all, just to clarify, my field is Bible, which in Hebrew would be Mikra and not Tanakh, and it's kind of different. When we're talking about Tanakh, the conceptual approach that goes along with that is one where it's ours. It's part of our identity, part of our history, very clearly part of our Jewish story. Whereas when approaching the Bible in the academy, we're looking at it from a distance, academically, scientifically. It's not even clear that it belongs in academic Jewish studies. So at the AJS Association for Jewish Studies conferences, there's actually a very small, nice but small Bible representation every year. And it's not always clear in any given Jewish studies context of the academy that Bible even belongs. So I think first off, that's kind of a distinction that's not really obvious when you're coming from the perspective of, this is my Tanakh that I grew up with, and, we study it as sort of the beginning point of the entire chain of tradition. It's part of that chain, and it's ours. And that is very much different from the stance that you take when approaching it academically. I begin.
Let's hear from our other Tamara.
Yes. So one of the major differences, which in a sense I think goes together a little bit with what Yael was talking about, is that really in the field of history, one of the things that's simultaneously very liberating but also very strange to someone who comes from sort of a religious perspective and then goes on to do Jewish history, is that you're in a field, and this is especially true in most universities in the United States where there is no Jewish studies department separately. So you're in a regular history department. And you're dealing with this, in a sense, together with many other people who are dealing with different historical periods. And in a way, it's not so engaged, meaning everyone has their topic that they study. And the reason I said it's very liberating is that nobody asks you why specifically that topic, why specifically those people, why this time period. Other than, you have to prove that it answers an interesting question, or that it matters somehow, or that it's good comparatively, or something like that. But you usually don't have the issue of having to justify why, which makes it very liberating, because you don't need to explain to people why Jews, why this period, which, my undergrad I did in philosophy, and there I find it much harder, because there you have to some way justify that the philosophy you're dealing with is, somehow matters to you more or something. Whereas in history, anything's fine, and I've had many colleagues that I'm good friends with that deal with things that frankly, I don't understand why they want to spend their whole days doing that, but that's fine, and it's legitimate, and I don't have to, in a way, explain it to them either. So in that sense, it's very liberating. And in another sense, obviously, one of the reasons, personally, that I'm interested in this stuff is something that, in a way, they wouldn't understand. Right? To say that I'm interested in the history of the Jewish people, and I'm interested in the history of halakha, because it personally means a lot to me, and there are questions there that I feel I need to answer for personal reasons, religious reasons, identity reasons. That's why I'm drawn to it. That's why I think it's something that's worth doing with my time. And those kind of things are things I can never say to them. So there's a strange divide that on the one hand, I don't owe anyone an explanation, but somewhere they don't get me all the way. So I'd say that's the biggest difference to me.
Thank you. Chaim?
Okay, hi. So I'm like a little bit of a weird fish because I'm not really in Jewish studies. I live in a law school. And that's like a very different world than I think what Yael and Tamara and to some degree Rabbi Berger are talking about, though it intersects in a lot of different ways. The word that came up repeatedly, which I have on my sheet too, is comparative. Is that, if you're doing Jewish law or halakha, in law school it's typically called Jewish law, and I think it's a little bit like the Mikra point. I was purposely called my book halakha. You're inevitably, if you're in an American law school and you're talking about Jewish law, you're inevitably talking about it comparatively, even if you're not directly. In the yeshiva, there's no sense, I don't think it's a goal, walking out of Shir and Bava Kama, that you can go and talk to a lawyer who does torts. It's like, maybe nice if you can, or maybe bad, but certainly it's not one of the goals. The frames of reference are different, and there's no attempt to do that. Sitting in a law school, if I'm writing in rabbinic Hebrew only, right, I will not be conceived of doing my job. I have to be able to talk to some sort of external and necessarily comparative body. The other thing, and this is what has driven me since my days in yeshiva, is that certainly when we think of things like Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, the things that are most, I would say, comparative to what we do in law schools, there's not a sense of like, what kind of world is this reflecting? What kind of commercial apparatus is this reflecting? What sort of tort system is this reflecting? Even with Masechet Sanhedrin, right, sort of what kind of criminal law regime is this reflecting? These are questions that honestly bothered me tremendously in yeshiva. And, maybe around the edges, but basically you don't ask those. It would be bizarre to say, the contract terms in Hamocher Sasfina make no economic sense and lead to inefficient results. Right? That would just be weird. I was that kid. I asked those questions, and I got the weird looks. That's exactly the kind of question you're going to ask in a law school. Sort of whatever the regime is, what does it make sense? Who does it favor? What types of commerce is it allowing or not allowing? So law school is very attuned. It's not, I think, like in classic GSAs, it's sort of textual critical language. It's not tools lawyers know much about, and in that way, it's quote safer than I think some of the disciplines y'all come from. Let's get a Latin word. But it's challenging in a different way because it's asking, well, what are the consequences of these rules? Who does it favor in society? A rule is this rule in Ona or Ribbit? It's like who? Like what sort of society is it constructing and representing, and what does that work, and how can it work? And these are questions that you typically don't ask in yeshiva. Also, right in yeshiva, you're typically not chasing down the Gemara, maybe into the Rishonim for sure, but a little bit into the Poskim, but not into the Shutim, and not into places where this thing actually gets hashed out. So you're also like the sort of Alajin tradition, obviously reflected in Yeshiva at Etzion, is not even like looking at that side of the world. So I think those, to me, are some of the big differences. I'll just pause because we're going to tell a little bit of stories. Like there's something, this is a little bit to the points you all made, right? That the why, right? In law schools, you sort of do have to ask, why are you studying this, right? One of the amazing things about yeshiva is that you need no reason to come up to somebody and say, I'd like to know, right, whether this form of transaction is rigorous or not, right? It's just something about yeshiva or yeshiva culture and really the way it presents sort of more widely that to me is of endless fascination, is that we constitute and construct these discussions that, I mean, some of them, of course, have no parallels in modern American law schools, but a lot of them do. And I always think, I'm teaching this doctrine in my contracts class, and, this is like, your contracts class, and what we're doing here is, preparing for a profession or whatnot. And I can come home that night and study basically the exact same thing, and we call it Avodas Hashem. And that's just like endlessly fascinating to me. Now, it's not always the same, of course, but if we just, to make the point, right, imagine that certain rules are exactly the same. We're very, very close. But yet, our emotions, our associations about them are totally different, right? It would be, I mean, you're not really supposed to learn during Chazar Sashas, right? But if you're sitting there, like with the Ravakama, it's okay. If you pull out Prostor and Torts, it's not. And these to me are some of the very interesting things, and really what so much drove me, both in yeshiva and thereafter.
Actually, what Chaim brought up is a great segue into the question of not just the differences conceptually, but actually the tensions or the conflict that academic Jewish studies poses to what we do in yeshiva, or even just to traditional interpretations of Torah and Halacha. And if you could give some examples, so Chaim, you kind of touched on that already, so why don't we hear from Tamara first, and then Yael, if you could just give some examples of where you see there being some conflict.
I want to make sure that you address some of these questions.
I was just added to raise the median age.
So in terms of tensions and conflicts, I mean, definitely the emphasis in those two worlds is very different, and often the tensions are just in my chapters generally, or my articles, or everything I write tend to be too long. And often the tension is just, where do I cut and what do I take out? And things that I find extremely important and like the most interesting part of what I'm doing and where it all matters. So I'll have some sort of, historical theory about, why a certain halakha is discussed in a certain way in the Middle Ages and then differently in the 16th century. And, the theory sounds very interesting, and I bring in all the, necessary thinkers about history and memory and law and how these things develop, and I do the whole bibliography part. And then I have like a, 50-page thing on Bechol Be'emat Teora in the Maran Avot Emot versus in Bermuth, and how it plays out. and how it exactly shows what I'm trying to say, and I find it super exciting. And then my advisor says, you know, this just makes me traumatized and I didn't even go to yeshiva, take it out. And you know, that's attention to me, like the thing where I always, you know, he's like, I know you have to prove you can do this thing, but really we don't care, it's fine. You know, we love the bibliography part where you brought in all these different theorists about history and memory, and we don't really need the whole heavy thing, and it's okay. And I'll try to justify it, in my opinion, on historical grounds and say, you know, but this is where I show that the theory works. Like, that's why we're historians, right? We care about how these phenomena play out in history. So, you know, I think in a way it's not attention, but definitely in terms of the emphases and the priorities of, you know, what you put out there versus what's the stuff you can stick in the footnotes or even cut out. I often sense these moments of tension. That would be one example, I think.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sure, so I think, look, I'm the Bible person here, so I am probably resting in the place where there are most sources of tension. Sources was a pun. But this really has to do largely with the theme of history, and you know, this plays out in a number of ways. So Bible scholars are very interested in, you know, what is the history, but really the prehistory of, you know, the text that we have. And, you know, the discussions and conclusions and many different hypotheses now that, you know, have played out here, you know, really are very difficult to reconcile with anything that could go on in a Beit Midrash. And I think it's very difficult. I think it just is. You know, I think a lot about something I read once in, you know, Hobbes' work, Leviathan. You know, after spelling out this very grand and detailed and complicated theory, he asks a bunch of challenging questions and then just says hard questions. And I think that's kind of where we get to when you're coming from this yeshiva perspective, and then you walk into the academy, and everything is very focused on history in a way that really is very difficult to square together. But that also plays out in other ways, like being interested in the historical background to the events and the people, and basically everything that you have written anywhere in Tanakh, and fleshing out, you know, the social background, the legal background, the cultural or economic or political or any kind of background that you have, which is incredibly illuminating potentially to how you read, you know, a given passage in Tanakh, but which is really not the kind of thing that one would expect to do, let's say, in a yeshiva context.
And I'll just add, I'm situated in a department of religion, which is its own, it's really its own beast, and one that self-flagellates regularly. Why we even exist is it's just a protective strategy for Protestantism. But it's a very serious thing that every 10, 15 years, the field goes through this kind of self-reflection. Why do we exist? Why should we be on an academic campus? Universities in Europe are arrayed differently in terms of the study of religion. So I also experience attention to follow up. The social scientific method is considered the only legitimate approach, really. I mean, to some degree, philosophy of religion, sometimes that happens in a philosophy department. But the trend in the last 20, 25 years, and that was something that I also wanted to highlight, that academic or intellectual orientations evolve in the academy. So when I went into Jewish studies, philosophy of religion was actually a very hot area. I mean, it was just, there was a lot, if anybody else, Nicholas Walter stuff, there was a whole, Richard Swinburne, there was a lot of writing and theorizing in philosophy of religion. And I went into it partly because I wanted to sort of be a Jewish voice in that conversation. But after I got an academic position and I was seeing what sessions they were having at academic conferences and who would accept my papers or articles, so unless you're writing about the other people's philosophy, so you're really just a commentator, you're not constructive in any way. Social scientific approaches, anthropology in particular, has become, and ethnography are now very, I mean, we have done at Emory about 4 searches in the last 6 years, and they all, 3 of the 4 touch on either anthropology or ethnography. Because if you want to bring in other voices that have not been, you know, they didn't leave a written record, or they don't, I mean, you want to study women, you know, in South India, women who are healers, they're not writing anything, they're not publishing anything. So the only way to really study them is to do an ethnographic study. So that sort of forces everything into what do you call presentism, in other words, what we could see today. But the categories that you would use are purely anthropological, sociological, the ideas that we would normally think about in yeshiva. And I remember Rabbi Lichtenstein Zatzal, we were together at several Orthodox forums that YU used to conduct every year around this time, because of the dinner. And the whole question of whether to historicize a Rishon, forget Chazal, right? But even a Rishon, like how would the Rambam come to this approach? And Rabbi Lichtenstein really articulated this tension, like we obviously has a different opinion than some other Rishonim. We're tempted to say influence of Greek philosophy or Aristotle or whoever it might be, or the Muslim milieu, but yet we in the yeshiva would look for other explanations as to why he had the position that he took. And it was with a sort of a real trepidation to bring in these very historic, socio-cultural and historical factors. So that's where I feel a lot of the tension in the academy. I have to resort to these tools to explain a lot of religion, and going back and doing either philosophy of religion or understanding things that, as I would see as more natural extensions of what we did in yeshiva, are much harder.
So can I? So I want to say 2 things. One, it's interesting. It's worth thinking about whether, you know, we talked about whether academic culture changes and how it changes. Like, it's interesting to think about whether and how yeshiva culture changes. But I just want to pipe in from a law school perspective again. There is a way in which there's something very challenging, because my guess is some in the room have been through an American legal education, and there's a story told in basically every law school, and it goes like this. Once upon a time, there was this thing called legal formalism. Legal formalism is a reasonable stand-in for brisk. Or brisk is a fair, maybe an extreme form of legal formalism. And that reigned, interestingly, in the like 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. And then around the 1910s, 20s, interestingly, when Jews start showing up on the American legal scene. So I would say you go from the 3 names to the 2 names, from the Oliver Wendell Holmes and Walter Wheeler Cooks to the Morris Cohens and the Felix Cohens and the Felix Frankfurters and the Morris Arnolds and the Benjamin Cardozas. All of a sudden, and there's an interesting story here to tell about Jews in the legal academy. It's like, you know, we've been enlightened, and a movement called American Legal Realism, which is very skeptical. And it's not a historical question, it's an analytical question. It's very skeptical that the legal materials, whatever they may be, are actually answering the legal questions. And that there's other factors that are typically go unacknowledged in the formal legal sources. Now, they debated what those are, but they were very skeptical that there's you get from A to B, and that like it's a necessary legal construct. One go the other. Very interesting. The metaphor they used was geometry, and for those who know, of course, the Rabb's works, physics is working that way. And then like the next 100 and something years are sort of, okay, we all believe in legal realism. What do we do now? How does law work? What do we do? And like there's lots of different theories. Now, this, to me, personally, was a very challenging thing. First of all, I was already feeling some of this. I had discussions with Rabbi Lichtenstein while still in yeshiva, and then I remember I came back, and first I was sort of floored that he had heard of American legal realism. You know, like, where we would have gotten this, I don't know, but he clearly knew, the main players, and we had a long talk about it. And it was one of those moments, like I remember wishing I could like bring him with me into the classroom and like talk to the professor, because like, no, but that really makes like a good point, isn't it? Like, what would you say? And I tried having this conversation with them, and of course I was chaser mikan mikan. So in that way, like what can seem in yeshiva as like a novel chiluk, or a new hakira, or a new way of analyzing things, to the realist is like, right, see, it's imminently plastic. Like, you could do that there, you could also do that there. And exactly what was so beautiful and sort of like, oh, we now like uncover in a kind of yeshiva way of approaching the sugya is precisely the data that the realist uses to see, you see, if you're really good at this, and yeshiva, Rabbi are nothing if not very good at this, it's imminently plastic. And that's sort of the lesson of American legal realism. And I think that way, it's touching. And of course, you can always, I think this is where it's different than Jewish studies, you can always draw a line, right? Torah l'chud and law l'chud. Because we're actually not studying Torah, we're studying law. But a sensitivity to the method, for in a certain type of person, your mind is likely to wander and to begin to try to, see how these things are affecting each other.
So let's turn to something a little bit more positive, and thinking about, could academic Jewish studies, can they benefit and support the traditional approaches? I mean, we spoke a little bit about tension for the last 10 minutes, but are there either mutually beneficial or supportive relationships between the two? And we'll start with Tamara in the middle, so we give you a chance.
So I definitely think there's...
And give examples, please.
So a lot of this can be supportive. I think definitely the way in which the discipline of history has evolved, intellectual history has evolved, is in a way to draw a much broader view. So if the way in which intellectual history used to work is that we look really at ideas and how ideas develop, which used to be sort of this, Spinoza came, and then this other guy came and changed his mind, so it was much more in the abstract. And I think then you had this sort of movement to look more at things around it. So when intellectual history used to be this abstract ideas, then it was an idea, okay, let's look at the surroundings, right? Let's look at the material history around it. Let's look at the social history, at the cultural history. And to some degree, I think, there's a point where you think it's going to reduce everything to, that level. To say, okay, well, every idea can be explained by the social surroundings. I think that's a little bit what you were talking about in terms of, does Rambam, does everything come from, who else he was talking to, right? Is it all just a question of that? And I think what you're getting, at least what I'm seeing now, and I'd say like my generation of scholars, is really an attempt to do both. So to say this isn't, ideas cannot be completely reduced to what's going on historically at the time around it, and to just, social reasons and economic reasons and political reasons. There are ideas too, but to actually be especially interesting, and that's where I think is, I think that's where history can really bring more and shed more light, is to look at how these interact, right? How do both of those interact? How is something similar and yet different in different points in time? How would, for the sake of, for example, your example, right? How would the Rambam have thought similarly had he been in a different time and place? And how would he have thought differently? Of course, we can't do these thought experiments, but you could often compare similar ideas, especially when you're studying the history of Halakha. You have the benefit of such a long tradition and a long textual tradition, because we don't have to necessarily deal with oral histories in Southeast India or whatever. We have long textual traditions. So it allows us actually to look very nicely at, well, how does this idea develop here and how does it there? And they often know about each other and they share the same tradition. So in that sense, I feel that the field of intellectual history at least has, in a way, come to a place where it actually becomes, I don't know if easier, but it becomes definitely mutually beneficial in the sense that, knowing about how a certain culture developed. What, in my case, I deal a lot with the printing press and with knowledge organization. So how knowledge is organized. One of the things I look at is how is halakha different when it's organized as a codification, for example, in the Shulchan Aruch, versus when it's just compiled without any order, or how is it different when it's codified but printed, as in the Shulchan Aruch, or when it's codified but not printed, as in Mishnah Torah, for example. So looking at those kind of differences, it actually teaches you a lot without necessarily reducing it and saying, well, it's all because of, for example, right, it's all because the Shulchan Aruch was printed in the 16th century, and that's why halacha looks the way it does, and it wouldn't have before, and it changed and somehow reduce it and take away the essential. We say, no, these tendencies existed before, they exist after, they're always there. What does this strengthen? What does this make less? So I think if you don't stick to those very gross stereotypes of, the historical being, well, it's all about, and I think, to some extent with legal realism, that if you don't stick to that stereotype, that all it does is reduce it to external factors, and then there's nothing left. If you nuance that a little bit, and you give these cultures, or in our case, halakha, credit that there's some sort of content to them, and that they are consistent, it's not all reducible, it can actually explain a lot, and it can actually really be beneficial.
Thank you, Yael.
Sure, so I would say first of all that, even though I think it's clear that in my field there are some real strong and difficult to overcome kinds of tensions between what goes on in the yeshiva and the academy, that gap is also one that in some ways is a bit of a fallacy, because the kinds of tools that are employed in the academy are kinds of tools that many of the traditional Mefarshim employed within the kind of confines of what tools were available to them at their time. So the grammarians, mostly from medieval Sfarad, used the tools that they had from knowledge of, another Semitic language, so Arabic mostly, to help understand the Hebrew that you find in the Tanakh. So today, we have access to even more languages. So this is the kind of thing, we have these tools at our hands that do require, years of study in a way that might not be appropriate for the Beit Midrash, but are appropriate in the academy, that allow us to understand words. Just at the lexical level in the Tanakh, to understand a word that might be difficult by drawing on cognates from other languages that we now have access to. This is just one, I think, very simple way that the academy is able to enhance the kind of Tanakh study that goes on in the Beit Midrash. But it, of course, gets larger than that, and even recourse to knowledge of history from the ancient Near East, from knowledge of archaeology in Eretz Yisrael. These are the kinds of things that you find a note somewhere in the Ramban where he says, I went to Israel and I saw this, and this helps us understand this pasuk here. Can you imagine if Ramban had access to the results from the excavations going on in Israel today and during the last century? Do we think he would have ignored them? To me, it's not even a question. So I think there's so much that's going on in the academy that is so obviously able to enrich any person's study of Tanakh, even if they're not able to access some of the primary sources because of the years of study that are required in order to access them in the original languages. But there's a lot available in translation, and there are teachers who are capable of introducing them properly. But I'll add just one more thing. I think that the kinds of questions that academics ask can sometimes illuminate study of Tanakh in ways that you wouldn't just get from looking at Tanakh in a traditional way. So, for example, I think this is a famous one, the comparison of the structure of the Brit to ancient Near Eastern treaties between a suzerain or sovereign king of the ruling state and vassal kings who would have to pledge their allegiance to the sovereign king, and the sovereign king would promise them certain benefits and protection in exchange for that. And there's this whole structure, a very formalized structure to these treaties that you can identify in the Brit between Hashem and Bnei Yisrael in Sefer Shemot and in other places in the Torah. And that raises questions such as why is the Brit formulated this way, and the way that enables us to think about the relationship between Hashem and Bnei Israel that's portrayed in certain parts of Tanakh is, it's just something different than what you would be able to do without those tools. So these are just a few examples.
I'd also like to turn people's attention, as many of you know, Professor Yaakov Elman passed away not long ago. And a lot of his writings were circulating on the internet. And one of them that caught my attention was actually a response to Rav Lichtenstein. So Rav Lichtenstein, I don't remember the context, I think it was one of the Orthodox forums about academic Jewish studies, and he was very critical of the approach of Talmud study in particular. And Yaakov wanted to defend the study of academic Talmud study, that actually one of the things Rav Lichtenstein lamented was how difficult it is to get high school kids interested in Havayot Davai Grava. Just like it's just difficult because they don't relate to it, whatever. And Yaakov pointed out through his study, particularly as you know, he started this whole field that Shai Sekunda wrote a book on, this Irano-Jewish studies, and understanding the Talmud in its context. And he said, if you understand like Machoza or just the neighborhoods of these different Amoraim, and let that illuminate some of the conversations that are going on in the sugyas themselves, we can actually excite our high school students and even some college students to what is going on in the Talmud and show them that it's really still a very living text because these were real people that just contextualized, not saying that their position was predetermined somehow, like reduce it to a socioeconomic position, but if you sort of know the world in which Rav Huna was living, and let's say Rava had different perspective, you could understand the same way we would, like today, every kid understands that Eretz Israel and America are just different Jewish worlds, even the Orthodox. Even though there's a lot more intercourse between the two, it's just, certainly the Haredi, I have family in the Haredi world, from both sides, in Lakewood and in Meir Sharm and Bnei Brak, and those two don't fully understand each other. And you could say, don't say Haredi, that there's real specific differences, and that can help us understand some of the way they look at the world Jewishly. And so Yaakov was trying to defend academic Talmud study, that it can actually illuminate something from a pedagogic standpoint. I do want to turn
Can I jump on that?
Sure, please.
So I just want to make like a structural point and then an example, is that I think part of what's going on is, without using the word modern Orthodox in a deep sense, right? But like, we all live in both of these worlds to one degree or another. So I think part of what's going on is that the result of not doing something like this is that you just have to draw a sharp line between my Jewish life, my intellectual, my frum life, my mitzvah life, and my other life. And that works for some, and that doesn't work for others. So we are all involved in translation projects. And I think sometimes, right, we're bringing the outside in and sometimes the inside out, or both all at the same time. So I think that the way to think about this is sort of, what are the other options, right? I want to think, imagine a world in which frum people are not involved in this in any way. So people are still going to ask these things and talk about these things. And I don't think you can avoid that because we live dual lives to some degree. But I want to give an example because I think, and this is to the pedagogic point, that a lot of what I try to do is, I think legal theory or legal philosophy, if you will, it helps clarify the stakes of legal debates. And the Gemara is nothing if not legal debates, but its stakes are sometimes occluded unless you're a super genius and you can see it through the language of Gemara. I certainly can't. But I found that when I understand this topic, the Alma, so to speak, all of a sudden, subtle things in the Gemara, the Rishon, the Chron, whatever it is, oh, that's what they're talking about. Because of course, Gemara feels very long, and it is, but it doesn't actually always tell you what it's thinking. It's, at the end of the day, you have very concise answers, 3 or 4 words that then all the Rishon try to figure out what it means. So let me give an example that to me totally changed the way I looked at the sugya of Hashavas Aveda. So Hashavas Aveda, both because of who we teach it to. It's often one of the first things taught. And because, you think of what gets lost in our world. So we think of baseball gloves and bicycles and things like that. So there's a very kid-centric way that both Hashem Veda is taught, so it's taught to and what it's about. And I think that's, okay, this is like a cute mitzvah, okay, be nice. Return stuff. But then, if you start understanding that, in American law and in Western law generally, there is no chiyuv of Hashem Veda. Because there's a political theory behind it. It's like, how can you, if I didn't cause the loss, by what right do you demand my time? That gets interesting. So all of a sudden now we have this thing that, no, what the halacha says is that I have an obligation to you though I didn't cause it. But then, of course, where are the lines to that, right? Because, of course, at some point I'm going to have to preference my own issues in my own life. I can't run around fixing people's roofs, because Hashem Veda becomes there's this wonderful Tosefta where it says, not just something that's lost, but if you see the Nahar that's coming, and then mitzvah ligdor, right? You have to hire people and fence off the river and send it somewhere else. And then it says if you're lost in the Kramim, so then Hashem Veda includes being able to trespass on other people's lands. Tosefta says something fascinating. It says, Shalmanasken hinchil Yoshua l'bnei Yisrael ta'aretz. So that line, if you know something about property theory, ring in your head, because saying, what is the nature of property? Is it a social compact? Or is it a sort of natural right? So the Tosefta here is taking a position on that. And the halacha then flows from that. So I think, to me, when you bring these background things that, at least to someone at my level, are not evident from the internal sources alone, then all of a sudden, it becomes a very rich discussion about the realm of responsibility we have to others and where the bounds are. So the sugya is about if you have to get paid, and how much you get paid for Hashem Veda, when is Chaim, when is Pater, all about this vast social question that we ask in political and legal theory all the time. Now, maybe a genius can see that just from the internal sources. I can say I can't. And it has totally enriched the way I engage in this, and happy to talk about other examples later.
We only have another 2 minutes to wrap up, and obviously a lot of Talmidim and Talmidot after yeshiva and Migdal Oz go on to university, or just the academic world. They feel that tension. I'm speaking on a personal level. What advice al regel achad might you give them, just as they're walking in, they're leaving yeshiva, or they're making that first visit back, and they felt the tension of the two worlds. What might you say to them? We'll start with you, Yael.
I think this is very difficult because I think in some cases, there might be appropriate mentors from the yeshiva or the midrasha that the student is coming from, who they can, continue a conversation with as they approach new tensions. But that's not always the case, because you need to have someone who actually is conversant in this in order to address it with them. So if they do have someone like that, then I would tell them to stay in touch. And in some cases there is, I mean, my first semester of college, I took my first academic Bible course with a Fromm professor who ended up then being my advisor, for my PhD. And I mean, that was invaluable, and that could have not been my experience. But this is very tricky because it depends on who is available to guide and mentor a person, and I don't think there are many people, at least in my field, who are qualified to do this.
Thank you, Tamara.
So I was thinking about this a little bit in preparation for this panel, and I was just thinking about the fact that I went to Beis Yaakov before going to Migdal Oz, and then I always thought that I'm going to go to Migdal Oz to learn more, right? I'm going to go to get the Jewish study stuff I didn't get back in Beis Yaakov. And what ended up happening, in addition to being able to learn more, which was very special, is that in a way which I didn't expect, it actually prepared me for going to university and for the academic part, which I didn't think I would get at a midrasha. But I think we've been talking about this very generally as a problem of, modern orthodoxy or being academia versus yeshiva. I mean, it depends what yeshiva. probably, I mean, it sounds like, it also depends what academia, what mentors you have. I mean, in my case, I can't say I've had too many mentors who can help me navigate these things. But I definitely think that if you go to a type of midrasha where you have people who are on the one hand deeply committed and religious, and on the other hand who do not shy away from any questions, and who are able to hold complex and sometimes difficult things in their mind together. And you have examples of people who study at a place like Michlelet Herzog and who can teach, and you have someone like Gav Medan teaching Tanakh. It shows you that at least that it's possible. And in those terms, I think that gives you a lot. And I mean, I'd say in absence of mentors, I mean, I can't say I found anyone to show me that way, but I mean, Chaim and I have had conversations about this often. I found myself becoming very interested in Rabbi Yaakov Emden for some reason. And I think it took me a while to realize why, but one of the reasons is that he wrote this historical, philological, linguistic analysis of a hallowed Jewish religious source, in this case the Zohar, on the one hand. And I mean, and this academics are happy to talk to you about all day, and how Rabbi Yaakov Emden is like, an early maskil, and he's like going to, against all these mystical sources. But the stuff they sometimes overlook, maybe because they're not looking deeply enough, is that in his tshuvot he uses Kabbalah all the time. And in many ways he's definitely, I mean, he can be saying that the Zohar was maybe not completely written by Rashbi, and then on the other hand be using it everywhere, excitedly and enthusiastically. And in a way, like, that became my mentor in a sense, right? Thinking, well, how did someone like that hold it together? Or like Yael mentioned, right? The Landman, would he have ignored these things, right? So in a way, you can find mentors everywhere as long as you know that, that these tensions are possible and you can live with them and you can hold them together. And I mean, I think they make both academia and Jewish life all the richer for it.
I have 30 seconds. I can say it to a Talmud cover.
So I'll say very simply, one of my mentors is sitting here at the other end of this panel, Rabbi Berger. I grew up in Atlanta, for those who don't know, and sort of my coming to Gush was in part both of the family connection and Rabbi Berger's connection. And we spent a lot of time, 15, 20 years ago talking about these things. I also think that, maybe in Berlin in the early 19th century, or the late 19th century, people's sort of desire to be or not be from, or it was like a very intellectual, also they read, a Bible theory and that's it, they took up the own gun. Whether that was true, I'll leave to the historians. I don't think that's what happens. I think it's that when people are affiliated with the community and see themselves in the Torah and in their community and in their yeshivot and in their ramim, which is, again, why I think Higher Saiman does such an amazing job, then these things are like, questions that people talk about and whatnot. I don't think, people staying or leaving it today I think it's much more affiliational and much less intellectual. And therefore, I think that the strength that the yeshiva does in providing that affiliation, and I don't think any Rebbe or Rosh Midrash or whatever it is needs an answer. It just needs to be a place to talk. And if we could talk about this, and I could see myself and the strength and the power that the yeshiva has and its religious imprint, I'm part of that. These other things, they find their boxes in a way that's much easier in my opinion.
Thank you very much. There's a whole list of other things going on, so we don't want to take more time than we have. Thank you all very much, and mazel tov to the yeshiva on the